Now we're going to move on to modules and why I think they're really exciting and kind of how they got here and really just how modules are just consuming JavaScript in general and not just Node.js. So let's move on to that. So if you're following along, I'm on the modules page now on the documentation website. And let's kind of think about if we were making a website right now, a JavaScript-based website, how would we share or how would we include JavaScript in other JavaScript, right? So the obvious answer might be, well, script tags. Well, if you have a script tag, you can, put one script tag before another, and as long as there's something on the global or something somewhere, the script tag after the previous one has access to the code inside of there. And that's what we did for a long time before modules came along. So you'll see something like, if you all might be, if you're new to programming, you probably haven't seen this, but if you've been around a long time, you've probably seen something like window.app equals window.app or an object, because in every single file, you would put something like this to declare your global app that you have to share across many JavaScript files that you were including. And then we moved on to something like bundling, where we would take all the files and we would use something like Bowser or Gulp, and we would combine them into one file. So we didn't really need to do this anymore because everything was combined into a single file at the end of the day, even though they were written in separate files. And then something came along from Node, and that's when we had something called like universal module syntax. And basically what that did was it transformed all of your files to be encapsulated in like their own closure. So you could think of it like this. It pretty much looked like some type of function that was like immediately invoked, and all your code was protected inside of here. So because it's inside of this function, it doesn't leak out to the global space. And at the end of the day, that's basically what a module was. It was this transportable piece of code that was shared across other JavaScript files, and that way they don't conflict with each other. There's no conflicting, there's no global space leaking, nothing like that. And you're able to access different things by like returning it. So if I return something here, I get access to it here. So that's basically what these tools did. So some of the first tools were like Browserify, if you ever heard of that. Webpack came along and all this crazy stuff. These tools are what's called bundlers. And these bundlers created modules out of your code. They allowed you to use modules. So that's kind of how Node.js got to where it is with modules. Where we are now with Node.js is that we have two different types of modules. So we have for lack of better words, the common modules, because it's literally called common.js, but it's also very common to see these modules where you'll see things like exports, require, and literally the word module. You'll see that a lot. So what does that look like? Well, let's make some modules. So if we go back into our file here, and we have a piece of code here, let's call it action. It's a function. Right now, this is just a piece of code. It's just a function. It doesn't really do anything. I'm just logging hello. And I could run this in the browser. I could also run this in Node, and it would work the same. It doesn't do anything. I'm not even calling the function. But the difference is, if I wanted to share this action function with another JavaScript file somewhere else in my application, in the browser, by having this just in the file right now, it's going to be attached to the global, so I can access it via window in the next JavaScript file. But in Node.js, there is no window. And nothing gets attached to the global space by default because all of your files inside of Node.js actually get encapsulated in their own little module, so they don't leak. It's not going to get attached to the window by default. So what you have to do here to be able to expose this piece of code, that way it can be used in another module, another file, is that you have to explicitly say, I want this piece of code to be a module. I want it to be usable somewhere else. I want to export it. So with the common.js syntax, you would see something like this. You would see module.exports equals, and then whatever you wanted to export. So in this case, I want to export the action function. And what this allows me to do is in another file, and I can call it app.js, I can say const action equals require, which is another global. It's a function, and it takes a relative path to another JavaScript file that you want to bring into this JavaScript file. So relative to the app.js, I want to include index. And I don't have to put JS here if it's a JS file. You're going to find out we're probably going to use a different type of file that we do have to put an extension. But if it's for CommonJS and it's a JS file, you don't have to put the extension. You can just exclude it and it will work. So now inside of here, I'm able to have access to that action function and I can call it. I'm going to save both of these files. I'm going to go over to my node, my terminal here. I'm going to run node. Instead of running it against the index.js file, which just creates the function and exports it, I'm actually going to run it against the app.js file, which requires the index file and executes it there. So it's kind of like creating a dependency tree, like a graph almost of dependencies. So I'm going to run it against app. And as you can see, it does execute the action function, which caused the log there. So we were able to share this action function here to this app.js by using this module.exports. So module.exports can pretty much export whatever you want. I could have wrapped this in a function an object if I wanted to. I could have done however I wanted to export this. You might also see, not so common anymore, you'll see some people do like exports.action, which is the equivalent of doing something like module.exports and wrapping it in an object. You don't really see this anymore, so I don't recommend doing that. I recommend just always using module.exports at the bottom of your file somewhere and then exporting the things that you want to be export. And the things that you don't want to be export, you just don't include them here. And that way they're private to this file. Like I said, this is called CommonJS. And this is what's been the standard for Node.js for quite some time. It's what ships with Node.js. It's the default module syntax for Node.js. But we're going to use the newer one because that's the future of Node.js. It's the future of the browsers. It's the attempt of all the browser people and the Node.js people coming together and be like, okay, how do we simplify this? How do we make it to where JavaScript is truly universal across environments? How about we start with the modules? How about we get on board with the latest module syntax that's been adopted by the JavaScript ecosystem for quite some time now? And that's going to be called the ES modules or ECMAScript modules. So that's what we're going to be using in this course because we have access to it on version 14. So that's what we're going to do. In fact, I think it was introduced in maybe version 10. Don't quote me on that, but it's been here since version 14. So in order to do that, a couple things we have to do. First, we have to tell Node.js what version of modules that we want. And there's a few ways we can do it. We can be explicit by using the .mjs extension. I know, another file extension, I get it. I was kind of skeptical to .jsx and then .tsx and all this stuff. Like, why can't I just use JS for everything? But yes, MJS, which is module.js, is an extension that you can use. And by doing that, you're going to let Node know that, hey, I'm using ES modules in this file. So use that instead of the .js. Another way you can do it is you can actually go into what's called a package.json, which we will talk about. And you can just say, I want to use type, ECMA, ES modules or whatever in here. And it will still allow you to use the .javascript extension, .js extension, but also opt in for the ES modules. We're going to keep it simple and just be explicit. That way we don't confuse ourselves. We don't, we're not in a place where we're not really sure what modules are being loaded. We'll just use .mjs for all of our files going forward in this course so we know what's being used as far as the modules go. So to get back to our code, so we looked at what this looks like if we were to export using CommonJS. Now let's look at what this will look like if we were to export using ECMAScript modules or ESM. So we still have our function here. We can get rid of this. And instead, we could just put the word export in front of it. Not to be confused with exports, which is CommonJS. Exports is a CommonJS thing that allows you to do exactly this. Exports, and you would get rid of this const, I'm sorry. You would say exports.action. But the word export, without the S, not plural, can be placed before like a variable declaration like this. And it's now going to expose this variable to be able to be imported in another file. So we're going to save that. But this also creates what's called a named export. And the reason it's called a named export is because when you import it over here in this file, I have to import it by the name of the variable that comes after the exports word. So in this case, it was called action because that was the name of the variable from index. And this should still work. So we replace the require function with this import keyword. Because it's a named export, we have to wrap it across, we have to wrap the brackets around it to actually get the name. And then we use the from keyword followed by the relative path to this file to the module that we want to import. So now we'll do that. And then lastly, we need to rename these to MJS. So we have to say MJS, and this has to be MJS. So once we get that, we can save them, we can save it, we can go back to our code, and now I can run node against MJS, and we still get the same result. We get hello. So this is the syntax that we're going to be having going forward. I think this is really helpful because browsers are now adopting ECMAScript modules. You can actually write modules in the browser now, which are really cool without a build tool. So you don't need something like Webpack or Rollup to write JavaScript modules, although you still need those tools if you want to make a PNG a module or a CSS file a module. For sure, you still need those tools. But if you're just writing JavaScript and you want to have some nice modules, you can just do that natively in the browser now. And now that you can do it in Node, I mean, the code is truly universal. If you wrote JavaScript that didn't really depend on any environment-specific thing, that didn't need a polyfill, you could theoretically just write one code and have it execute everywhere, depending on what the code was. I don't know how useful that would be, but you could totally do it. So yeah, very powerful stuff here. Any questions on these modules? So the question was, if I'm using CommonJS in a project, could I gradually switch over to Module.js? The tough answer is it's not as simple as, it's the graph nature of how dependencies work, right? So if I have a MJS file that I just created because we're switching over to ECMA modules, but it's being consumed by a file that was already there that was CommonJS, well, now they have to interact with each other. So what runtime is going to be executed when that happens? So and then you also have like third-party modules or packages that you have to install that may or may not also have those modules, ECMA modules or CommonJS modules. So it's really hard to determine which one. And it also depends on how you opt into the Module.js. If you explicitly go into the package.json and say, I'm using this explicit type, I'm using ECMA modules, then Node.js is going to assume the entire project is that way. Whereas if you only use the MJS file, then you're opting in just for that file. So to give you an example of what that will look like, so let's say we change this back to JS. And then instead of putting export here, what I will do is const action, and I'll go back to module.exports equals action. In fact, I'm going to keep it the same, so I'll do that. I'll wrap it so it's named. We'll save that, and then we'll go back and run it. And you can see I do get the same result here because I'm entering the app from a MJS file. Here we go. I pointed it to an MJS file, so that's the entry point to the file. And then the MJS file was able to interop with the CommonJS file specifically because I knew that imitating a named import in CommonJS meant that I had to basically export an object with the name properties. Whereas if I did it the other way, this wouldn't work because now MJS would assume that this is like a default export, right? So if I ran this, you can see I would get an error because there's no such thing as action, right? So if I got rid of this and executed it, I get the same thing. So the question is, can you do it? Yes, you can do it, but it's not as simple as just going in and changing everything to MJS. You have to figure out the right module syntax to interop between the different dependencies that you have across files. And depending on how many files you have, that can be very tedious. But there is a path there, it's just not automatic.
Is the MJS extension requirement? I mean, can we like use JS and still make it work, the ES7 modules?
Yes, so if you go into the package.json, there's a field you can add called type. And I believe if you put type module, it'll give you the ECMAScript module, or there's a specific word that you have to put there. And I'll look that up on the break and give you the exact one. I always just use MJS, so I like to be explicit. But yeah, if you don't like the MJS extension, which is kind of gross, yes, you could just opt in the entire project via the package.json and say, everything is MJS. That way I can use .js and it still is MJS. Any other questions on modules? So the question is, if I'm like using some other modules, whether it's like NPM or maybe it's internal, something else, and they're using CommonJS, but I want to use ECMAScript modules, is there going to be conflict? The answer is it depends on how they export those modules. The real answer is it doesn't matter what the conflict is, you should be able to get around it if you can determine on how they actually export their modules. You can go look at the source code. You can see what they're doing. Like, are they doing with CommonJS, are they doing a default export? Are they doing a named export? Are they doing something like exports dots? When you use ECMA, there's a way around all of this, right? So I showed you that this is a default export if you don't put brackets around it. This is a this is a default import if you don't put brackets around it. And this is a named import if you do put brackets around it. So it really just depends on how that maintainer or the author of that package exported those modules and how you can interop with them. But there is a path for every scenario for you to do that. And then as far as like the ones that ship with Node that we'll talk about, they're already supported by ECMAScript modules. So they're good to go. We don't have to wait for them to update anything. We can just start using them right now without the CommonJS. All right, so far we've just been talking theoretical stuff, not a lot of hands-on work. But this is just some of the stuff that I really wanted to explain and really want everyone to get the hold of, to get their hand around. That way we can actually start doing some stuff. So the one thing I did want to talk about is some of the internal modules that ships with Node. So it's kind of like the globals that ship with Node. You can think of them as that, but just in the module form, things that we can import that's already given to us without having to install anything. So a few of the favorites you'll see, like file system, which is FS, we're going to use that. Path, which is great for interacting with file paths and transforming and manipulating them, which is extremely helpful. Child process is a really great one. It's used for spawning sub-processes that happen in the background that can communicate with a main process to do like tedious tasks and CPU-intensive tasks, things like that. And then HTTP, which is the foundation of pretty much any server interaction, any internet interaction with Node.js. It has access to the OS level, sockets and connections, and exposes them via a JavaScript API that we can find useful in Node.js. So you could experiment with these if you want, but we're going to go through a lot of them in the next exercises.